Hello and welcome. This is another in the 10-minute tip series of programs for credit and collection professionals. If you're interested in reviewing the entire series, they're available on YouTube. My name is Michael Dennis. This presentation today is about letters of credit. Let's go ahead and jump in. A letter of credit is a mechanism whereby creditor companies have a higher assurance of getting paid. A letter of credit includes a payment promise by the issuing bank. And you might be asking immediately, well, what is the issuing bank? It's the bank that's promising to pay the creditor. So not surprisingly, the issuing bank is your customer's bank. It's the buyer's bank. So the issuing bank issues a letter of credit listing you, the creditor, as the beneficiary. And it's that begins the process whereby there's a mechanism for you as a creditor to get paid. It's important to recognize that the payment promise made by the issuing bank to your company, the beneficiary, is in fact a conditional promise to pay. When I use the word conditional, what I'm saying is it is not a guarantee of payment. I think we could say this about a letter of credit. A letter of credit is a guarantee not to pay you as the creditor until and unless you are able to provide all of the required documentation to the issuing bank within the time limits that are described or are connected to the letter of credit. So the key is you as the creditor have to present accurate documentation within the specified time limits in order to have a high degree of assurance that you're going to get paid under the terms of the letter of credit. It's important that you recognize and that your company and its management recognize that a letter of credit is not a guarantee of payment. It is a mechanism for payment. Generally speaking, creditors use letters of credit when they consider the customer, the buyer, the applicant company to be high risk. In other words, when the applicant company, for whatever reason, is not considered to be credit worthy. When that happens, one of the options, rather than, for example, requiring payment on a cash in advance basis or wire transfer payment in advance basis, is to offer the buyer, the customer, the applicant, the option of providing a letter of credit. So clearly we would do that if and when we were deeply concerned about the customer or the applicant's ability to pay if we were to offer products on open account terms. Another reason that we use letters of credit is when the country in which the buyer is located is considered by us to be high risk, or such high risk that we are not willing to offer open account terms to that buyer in that country, and therefore we look for a different mechanism for payment, such as through a letter of credit. And of course, and not surprisingly, we often use letters of credit when both the customer and the country in which the customer is located are considered by us, the creditor company, the credit decision maker, to be so high a risk that we are not willing to offer open account terms. I want to talk about letter of credit instructions. My position is this: we creditors should provide or create first letter of credit instructions that we deliver to the customer, to the applicant company, to the customer, to the buyer. The instructions that we want are very specific as to what the letter of credit needs to look like, what the terms should be, under what conditions we're willing to ship product upon receipt of a letter of credit. What happens then after we have created these letter of credit instructions and delivered them to the customer is that our customer would then deliver those instructions to their bank. If you remember, their bank is the issuing bank, the bank that will be responsible for making payment pursuant to the terms of the letter of credit. So we create them, we send them to the customer sends them to their bank. After that, the bank will begin the process of issuing the letter of credit. What we want to ensure is that our LC instructions state that we are to receive a draft copy of the letter of credit. In other words, before the letter of credit is actually issued, we want to look at it. We want to look to make sure that the letter of credit has followed the letter of credit instructions that we provided to the customer, that the customer has in turn provided to their bank. The good news here is that the draft stage errors are easy to fix. And not surprisingly, when we go beyond this point, when the letter of credit is issued, things become more complicated. So we need to look very carefully at the draft letter of credit and identify any discrepancies or problems with the document and with the language. And we definitely want that corrected at that point, because again, it becomes more complicated beyond the point where we're looking at a draft of the letter of credit. Let's talk for a moment about letter of credit amendments. So once the letter of credit is past the draft stage and the letter of credit itself has actually been issued by the issuing bank, any changes that we want to the contract, any changes that we want to the terms and conditions, can only be made by the process referred to as creating an amendment to the letter of credit. The first thing that you need to know about an amendment is that all parties need to agree to the amendment. So we, the creditor, wants the amendment. The buyer has to agree to the amendment. The issuing bank has to agree to the amendment. If there's a confirming bank, they have to agree to the amendment. So very quickly it becomes fairly obvious that amendments become a process of complicating rather than simplifying the process of getting the letter of credit in a position where we can ship against it. Because to this point, we haven't shipped anything. All we've been doing is looking at documentation. If in fact you need an amendment to the terms of the letter of credit, that creates a problem for you, because generally speaking, creditors do not ship when an amendment is required. They do not ship, in fact, until the amendment is received. And I would strongly encourage you not to ship if you review a letter of credit. It contains terms that are unacceptable to your company as the creditor, and the only thing you have is an assurance from someone that an amendment is going to be made to the letter of credit. Well, that might occur or it might not occur. And the difference is that you need to ensure that you're going to get paid under the terms of the letter of credit, which is exactly why you're requiring the amendment. It's important to recognize that amendments are time-consuming and they're expensive, which is of course why we provide LC instructions to begin with, so that we avoid any costly and time-consuming changes necessitating an amendment to the letter of credit. So clearly, if you receive a letter of credit that does not contain terms or conditions that are acceptable to you as the seller, my recommendation is that you do not ship the products until the amendment itself is received. In other words, we don't accept someone's assurance that an amendment is forthcoming. We actually wait for the documentation to arrive. We look at that documentation, we ensure that the amendment is acceptable, and then we release the order for shipment. Letter of credit discrepancies. So a discrepancy, the term discrepancy as it relates to letters of credit, refers to an error or more than one error that's been found by the issuing bank when you, the creditor, presents the documents that are required in the letter of credit to be presented to the issuing bank. The bad news for you as a creditor is that if and when a discrepancy is found, time is short. You need to move as quickly as possible to fix or cure the discrepancy. One of the problems is that you may not be able to fix or cure the discrepancy. The real problem is not that you can't cure the discrepancy, but that the bank isn't required to issue payment if you present documentation that has a discrepancy in it. For example, if a signature is missing, you may not be able to cure that discrepancy. It may say, as an example, you need a signature from the ship captain on the date that the product is delivered onto the ship. Well, you're not going to be able to get a signature from the ship captain on the date that the product was delivered onto the ship unless you have a time machine, because the product's already on the ship. So if that signature is missing, That's going to be a discrepancy that you're not likely to be able to cure. And again, the problem for you as a creditor is that the issuing bank is not required to make payment if the documentation you submit in support of your request for a payment includes a discrepancy, one or more. When a discrepancy is found, what you need to do is you need to act as quickly as possible and send the corrected documents. If again, you're in fact able to do that, if you're able to correct whatever the issuing bank has determined to be the discrepancy that they identify to you as being problematic, as the reason that they're not able to make payment under the terms of the letter of credit. I want to give you just a few quick examples of some common letter of credit discrepancies. The merchandise is not described on the invoice exactly as it's described in the letter of credit. There's not enough copies of the invoice or other required documents presented to the issuing bank. For example, the LC might say you're required to provide 4 originals or 4 stamped original invoices when you submit the documentation to the issuing bank. Well, let's assume you submitted 3. That's not 4, and therefore you didn't submit enough copies of required documentation. Another common discrepancy is any scenario in which the shipping terms or other terms are different from those that are described in the letter of credit. More fundamentally, it's when documents don't match. It's as simple as that. For example, the description in the shipping documents does not match the description on the invoice. Or the invoice description doesn't match the bill of lading description of the merchandise of the product that you're shipping. Or the bill of lading doesn't match the packing list in terms of a description of the product being shipped. But this is just an example. There are far more discrepancies than we even have time to discuss in any degree of detail in this 10-minute presentation. These are just very simple examples of what might go wrong. Standby letters of credit. I want to touch on this very, very briefly. A standby LC serves a different function than the letters of credit that we've been talking about, which are referred to as documentary letters of credit. A standby LC is a secondary payment mechanism. With a standby letter of credit, what happens is you actually expect the customer to send payment as you would with any customer that you're offering open account terms. If the customer does not pay, then you as the creditor have recourse, and that recourse or protection is offered by the standby letter of credit. It says, the standby concept says, is the bank is standing by in the event that the buyer doesn't pay you as agreed. The good news from your perspective in connection with the standby LC is that you as the creditor will need to provide less documents under a standby LC than you would normally need to under a documentary letter of credit. So that's the end of this very brief presentation. My name is Michael Dennis. I want to thank you for your time and attention, and have a great day.